I appreciate very much the observation that was just made about the purpose of reconciliation in the Rules Committee in the House. The House very clearly has the power to regulate what comes to the floor, what amendments are made in order. Reconciliation instructions in the House bill are clearly directed at a House-Senate conference and reserving the opportunity, the option to actually do something with respect to these other issues in that. And I want to point out, too, because and I want to ask a question of the senator from Alabama regarding the conference committee. But even though the best intentions of the senator from North Dakota, and I believe he's sincere when he says that he doesn't want to use reconciliation to do cap and trade and to do other types of policy through the budget process, there's a statement here from the majority leader, and this was talking about the novel proposal for redoing the nation's health care system, suggesting that using $646 billion that would be collected under a controversial Obama proposal to auction off greenhouse gas pollution allowances, and the exact quote is, that's exactly how much we need for the first phase of health care reform. Mr. President, I would like to speak for a moment, if I might, to an amendment that I laid down yesterday, which has now been there's been a side-by-side offered by the senator from California with regard to that. And I would simply say, in response to the comments from my colleague from Illinois, that there aren't any Republicans who aren't prepared to debate the issue of climate change or energy policy or any of those things. We just think it ought to be debated in regular order, that when the Senate does take on big, consequential items like this, that it ought to be handled in the normal routine, the way that Senate deals with big, consequential issues, like the issue of climate change, because it would have a profound impact on the American economy and on American households and families. So there isn't any resistance on this side of that. All we're simply saying is it shouldn't be used as a part of the budget process where you expedite this and sort of circumvent the normal rules and procedures of the Senate that would apply to big pieces of legislation like this. And so we want to debate that, and frankly, there are lots of, I think, Republicans who are happy to have the debate on climate change, on cap and trade, but also want to make a part of that debate the cost. Because it's very easy to talk about, you know, these, throwing out these different solutions to this issue or talk about the general issue of climate change, but when you start reducing that argument on cap and trade, it has profound economic consequences on the American economy. And that's a part of this debate. I mean, if you look at the question of whether or not climate change is occurring, and if you answer that yes, and is human activity contributing to it, and if you answer that yes, you still have to get to the question, if those 2 points are true, then what do we do about it and at what cost? And we think that that ought to be part of the debate. Now, I will tell you, and this is, the senator from California has offered a side-by-side amendment to mine, and I assume that she concedes the point that it would increase electricity and gasoline prices. She adds to that the language, or increasing the overall burden on consumers through the use of revenues and policies provided in such legislation, suggesting, I think, that there would be some offsets that the families who are affected by higher energy costs would benefit from. Well, I would say to that, if there are going to be additional revenues, they're coming from somewhere. This isn't imaginary world. This stuff just doesn't appear. We're talking about real costs, real revenues. And I want to point out what the President himself said a little over a year ago about his cap and trade plan. He said, under my plan of a cap and trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket, end quote. You cannot assume for a minute, Mr. President, that there are not going to be enormous costs associated with the proposal that's coming from the senator from California. And the cap and trade proposal that she put forward in the last Congress, of which the President was a co-sponsor, she had referred earlier to MIT. Researchers at MIT on that proposal scored it at $366 billion a year, or a cost of $3,128 to the average household in this country. This has a cost, an economic cost it has an impact on our broader economy. It has an impact specifically on American families and households and American small businesses. I used some data yesterday that I'd received from utility companies in my state about how this would affect their cost of doing business with regard to residential customers, small business customers, large industrial users. You would see costs go up as much as 65%. In some cases, they use a typical school district, that it would double their cost on an annual basis for electricity. These things have costs. The American people, that needs to be part of the debate because the American people deserve to know that these things have costs. And we need to have a debate about climate change, but we ought to do it in a way that's in regular order, that allows the committees to do their work, and that contemplates what the costs and consequences of these policies are going to entail for the average person in this country. And so, Mr. President, I guess what I would simply just close in saying is that this is an amendment, I think, provided to give something for the Senator from California's members on the other side to vote for. But the fact of the matter is, a cap-and-trade policy will increase electricity and gasoline prices. Nobody disputes that. The question is how much. Now, I happen to believe, and a lot of others do, that the President understates it in his budget, $646 billion in revenue. There are those out there who believe it would be 2 or 3 times that amount. And the President himself has said, under my plan of a cap-and-trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. His OMB director, Peter Orszag, has said that this would all be passed on to consumers. Utility companies aren't going to bear the cost of this. Corporate America isn't. It's going to be passed on to customers in places like South Dakota, where higher utility costs, higher energy costs is the thing they can least afford these days when you've got a bad economy to start with. And so I hope that when people come to vote on these amendments, and I'll have mine, the Senator from California will have hers, bear in mind that these votes have consequences, and that if you vote against my amendment, you are essentially saying that we are open to and okay with a reserve fund created under the budget, a climate change reserve fund, that would lead to higher electricity and gasoline prices. All my amendment simply says is that those gas and electricity prices cannot go up under a cap-and-trade proposal that might be adopted by the Congress and might be included in some reconciliation instruction that comes from a conference committee with the House. I see my time has expired, and so I yield the floor. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we're going to have a vote in just a few minutes on an amendment that I offered yesterday and is now side-by-side been offered by the Senator from California, in which she tries to, I think, modify my amendment in a way that gives folks who want to be able to vote for something to vote for, when in fact my amendment is the one that's very simple and straightforward, and that is if we have a reserve fund created for climate change, revenues coming into that fund obviously are going to be significant, $646 billion if the President's budget is accurate, much more than that by many other analyses that have been done, but simply says that that cannot be used to increase electricity rates or gasoline taxes on the American consumer. And so what I would hope that my colleagues will bear in mind when we vote on this is any cap-and-trade system that is put in place, Mr. President, is going to have a significant increase in costs, energy costs in this country. You can call it what you want, a light bulb tax, a national energy tax, but it's pretty clear that's going to be the case. And insofar as the President a year ago even made the same argument, under my plan of a cap-and-trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. And that's a direct quote. And all the studies that have been done have suggested that this could cost anywhere from, depending on, CBO has said $50 billion a year to $300 billion a year. MIT said $366 billion a year. An enormous amount of money is going to come into the federal treasury by any form of cap-and-trade bill that is passed here in the Congress. And it just depends on how rigid or how restrictive the caps are as to what that cost is going to be. And there are several other bills that are out there. What I would like to point out, however, is the Senator from California, her bill, Senate Bill 309 from the last session of Congress, actually designates 7 different funds that the revenues would go into. Now, what her amendment would say is that a lot of these revenues would go back in the form of some assistance to consumers in this country. But in fact, if you look at her legislation, there are 7 different funds that it goes into, and essentially what her bill would do is take all these revenues that are going to come into the federal treasury and distribute them through government agencies to all these different areas. Now, you got Climate Change Worker Training Fund, the Adaptation Fund, whatever that is, the Climate Change and National Security Fund, the Bureau of Land Management Emergency Firefighting Fund, the Forest Service Emergency Firefighting Fund, the Climate Security Act Management Fund. That's just, those are 6 of the funds that are listed in her bill as uses of revenues that would be derived from a cap-and-trade and national energy tax that would be imposed upon the American consumers. Now, I point out, Mr. President, that MIT in their analysis of her bill said that it would cost the average household in this country an additional $3,128 annually in energy costs. The President himself has said, under my plan of a cap-and-trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. Nobody disputes the fact that rates are going to go up. And what we're saying is that shouldn't happen. We can't do that, particularly now at a time when the American economy is struggling and most Americans are having to tighten their belts already, to impose a huge national energy sales tax on American consumers would be very ill-timed. And frankly, I don't believe for a minute that any of the revenues that come in as a result of the imposition of that national energy tax are going to be used to refund the American consumers. There is the $400 and $800 tax credit the President has put in place, but that's a fraction of the amount of money that's going to come in, the revenue that's going to come in. So I hope that my colleagues will support my amendment and vote against the side-by-side that's being offered by my colleague from California. I don't think there's any question, but this is going to raise taxes, energy taxes, in the form of a national sales tax on energy for consumers in this country. My amendment would make it very clear that that cannot be the case. Mr. President, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. President. And I would say to my friend from California that when gas prices were going up last summer, many of us were working together trying to put together a plan that would increase production in this country. We had a very simple strategy. Let's find more and use less. And many of us were working constructively to try and come up with an energy solution that would increase domestic supply in this country so that we could drive down the cost of energy. I was engaged in that with a number of colleagues from the Senator from California's side of the aisle. But that has nothing to do with this debate, Mr. President. This, Mr. President, deals strictly with a cap-and-trade proposal, a national energy tax proposal that is being contemplated in this budget. And my amendment also is very straightforward and simple. It says that any reserve fund that is created as a result of this budget that would have a climate change or a call for climate change legislation cannot raise electricity rates for American consumers or raise gasoline prices. That is a tax on American consumers when they need it the least. I hope, Mr. President, that my colleagues will support my amendment.
Senator,
and
time has expired. The Senate will be in order. Senators, please take your conversations out of the Senate chambers.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, if you honestly believe that the trillions of dollars that are going to come in from a cap-and-trade proposal, what is essentially a national energy sales tax, if those revenues are going to be distributed back to the American people, then voting for the Boxer amendment was the correct vote. If you believe, like I do, that the trillions of dollars that come in through a cap-and-trade proposal are in fact not going to be rebated back to the American people, are going to go to fund programs here in Washington, D.C., then you should vote for my amendment. Because my amendment prevents any program that's created, cap-and-trade program, from increasing electricity rates or gasoline prices for American consumers. This is a national energy tax on the American people, on American consumers. If you want to vote against that, then voting for my amendment is the correct vote. I yield the floor.